Hello, I'm Tanya Chamberlain from the Division of Anatomy here at the University of Leeds, and in this video we are going to be looking at the anatomy of salivation. But why are we studying salivation? Well, saliva, as you'll know from looking at other aspects of the module, is very important. It is used to keep the mucous membrane of the mouth moist. It lubricates food during mastication. It contains enzymes such as amylase, which begin the process of digestion. It also acts as an intrinsic mouthwash, preventing tooth decay with its antibacterial properties. And it spreads the food and disperses it across our tongue to assist in the ability to taste. There are 3 large salivary glands, each on the side of the head. We have the parotid. This is located just in front of the ear, wrapped around the posterior border of the ramus of the mandible. It has a single duct that runs superficially to the masseter muscle of mastication, before turning medially to pierce the muscle of the cheek. So this is the buccinator muscle, one of the muscles of facial expression. It opens into the vestibule of the mouth, opposite the crown of the second upper molar. We also have the submandibular gland. We have 2 of these, one on either side, just as with the parotid. It is a horseshoe-shaped gland that has intraoral and extraoral parts. The extraoral part can be felt or palpated just below the lateral aspect of the body of the mandible. The intraoral part is located under or inferior to the mucosa of the floor of the mouth. The gland has a single duct that opens into the sublingual papillae. The papillae are located on the floor of the mouth, just behind the lower incisor. There are right and left papillae, which receive the ducts of the right and left submandibular glands respectively. And we also have the sublingual glands. These are the smallest of the 3 main salivary glands, located between the tongue and the mandible, and they open as a series of ductals along the sublingual fold. There are also many tiny accessory salivary glands in the mucosa of the tongue, palate, and lips. It's important to know these, but we are not going to look at these any further. Now, we've met some of the cranial nerves before, but I think it's worth pausing for a minute or two to make sure we understand what they are. Cranial nerves all emerge from the brain and leave the skull through specific foramina. In contrast, spinal nerves emerge from the spinal cord and leave through spaces in the vertebrae of the spinal column. There are 12 cranial nerves on each side of the body. Some just carry sensory fibres, whilst others carry motor fibres. However, most cranial nerves carry a mixture of the 2. The cranial nerves are numbered using Roman numerals 1 to 12. Nerve 1, the olfactory nerve, emerges from the brain most superiorly. The nerves emerge progressively more inferiorly until we reach 12, the hypoglossal nerve, which emerges most inferiorly to all of them. Most of the cranial nerves have named branches. In some cases, there are lots of named branches, for example in the trigeminal nerve. Today we'll be looking at the nerves that cause the major salivary glands to secrete. The nerve fibres stimulating secretion are called secretomotor fibres. The ones supplying the salivary glands run in the facial nerve, which is cranial nerve 7, and the glossopharyngeal nerve, which is cranial nerve 9. The nerve fibres that cause the salivary glands to secrete are all part of the parasympathetic nervous system, which in itself is part of the autonomic nervous system. This is the part of the nervous system that controls the functions that we don't normally have voluntary control over. Parasympathetic nerve fibres are associated with rest and digest functions, so it makes sense that they all innervate the salivary glands. As an aside, the other part of the autonomic nervous system, the sympathetic part, is associated with flight and fight functions. The nerves that carry the autonomic nerve fibres have swellings called ganglia on them. Autonomic ganglia are found where autonomic nerve fibres join onto other autonomic nerve fibres. The fibres coming into the ganglion, the preganglionic fibres, stop the ganglion by making functional connections or synapses within the cell bodies of the nerves that leave the ganglion, which are called the postganglionic fibres. The ganglion is present because it has to accommodate all of the cell bodies of the postganglionic fibres. Cell bodies are much thicker than the nerve fibres that come from them, so they take up a lot of space. When they are clustered together in one place, they form a ganglion. The postganglionic fibres then leave the autonomic ganglion and travel to the gland, in this case salivation, that they are going to stimulate. The secretomotor fibres travelling to the salivary gland often hitch a lift the branches of the trigeminal nerve, which is cranial nerve 5, in order to reach their destination. Note that there is another kind of ganglion as well as the autonomic kind. This other kind of ganglion also contains cell bodies, but there are no synapses present. These are sensory ganglia. An excellent example of the sensorial ganglion is the trigeminal ganglion. This contains all of the cell bodies of the vast number of sensory nerve fibres carried in the trigeminal nerve and its branches. So let's move on and look at today's learning objectives. The outcome of today should allow you to list the locations of the minor salivary glands, describe the locations of the anatomical relations of the major salivary glands, describe the routes that the ducts of the major salivary glands take, and identify where these ducts open into the mouth. And we should be able to describe the secretomotor nerve supply to the major salivary glands. As we've already kind of briefly mentioned the locations of the minor salivary glands, let's move on and look at the majors. We've already seen that the parotid gland is located in the posterior aspect of the face, just anterior to the ear. You can't tell that from this diagram, but the gland also wraps around the posterior surface of the mandible of the ramus, so it lies both deep and superficial to it. The parotid duct runs anteriorly across the masseter muscle before turning medially to pierce the buccinator and enter the vestibule of the mouth. The parotid gland receives its secretory motory function from the 9th cranial nerve, which is the glossopharyngeal nerve. In order to understand the course of these nerves that we're going to talk about today, let's just recap on some of the anatomical features found within this image. We have part of the brainstem called the medulla. And we also have the trigeminal ganglion, so this is from the trigeminal nerve, for which we know there are 3 branches. The first would be the ophthalmic branch, the second the maxillary branch, and then the third, which we're going to look at when we're looking at the parotid gland, is the mandibular branch. We also have another selection of nerves coming from the medulla. These are the tympanic nerves, which are going to branch into a tympanic plexus. The tympanic plexus is located within the ear canal, near the tympanic membrane, so near the eardrum. And we also have another ganglion which we're going to briefly look at today, which is the optic ganglion, which is the ganglion located near the ear. This picture gives us an understanding of the secretomotor pathways of the parotid gland. Cranial nerve 9, the glossopharyngeal nerve, arises from the brainstem and leaves the cranial cavity through a hole in the base of the skull called the jugular foramen. Just after doing so, it gives off a small branch, the tympanic nerve, which passes back through the middle ear cavity, which is found inside the temporal bone of the skull and contains the tympanic membrane, the eardrum, hence the name of this small branch of cranial nerve 9. Inside the middle ear cavity, the tympanic nerve temporarily breaks up into a network of fibres located on the medial wall of the cavity. This is called the tympanic plexus. The nerve fibres then come back together to form a single nerve. This is called the lesser petrosal nerve. The lesser petrosal nerve is called petrosal because it initially travels through the petrous part of the temporal bone. The lesser petrosal nerve, which is still carrying the preganglionic fibres that started in the glossopharyngeal nerve, leave the temporal bone to enter the cranial cavity. It runs under the brain for a short distance before turning downwards to leave the skull through an oval-shaped opening called the foramen ovale. The foramen also transmits the mandibular nerve, which is the third division of the trigeminal nerve. Just after leaving the skull, the lesser petrosal nerve enters the otic ganglion, which is an autonomic ganglion. This is where the preganglionic nerve fibres it contains end by making synapses within the cell bodies of the postganglionic nerve fibres. The postganglionic nerve fibres now have to get to the parotid gland. They do this by joining a branch of the mandibular nerve, called the auriculotemporal nerve. The auriculotemporal nerve carries the postganglionic fibres to the parotid gland. The pre- and postganglionic fibres supplying the parotid gland are all fibres of the glossopharyngeal nerve, which is cranial nerve 9. The fact that the postganglionic fibres hitch a lift in the auriculotemporal nerve doesn't alter this. The secretomotor nerve supply to the parotid gland is the glossopharyngeal nerve, not the auriculotemporal nerve, not the mandibular nerve, and not the trigeminal nerve. The auriculotemporal nerve is a nerve coming from the mandibular branch of the trigeminal nerve. This acts to provide sensory information to the brain. In this image, I have added to the diagram. We have included the sympathetic trunk and the superior cervical ganglion, which is the most superior of this chain of cell bodies. The superior cervical ganglion acts to provide sympathetic innervation to the parotid gland. In doing so, it acts on the vessels surrounding the parotid gland to constrict. This vasoconstriction reduces the amount of saliva secreted. Now, I appreciate that we've looked at 3 different nerves there and 3 different pathways for the parotid gland. But now we're going to move on to the submandibular and sublingual glands, and you'll be pleased to know that the innervation for these 2 glands is exactly the same, but not the same as the parotid gland. The submandibular gland lies immediately below the body of the mandible, just anterior to where the body meets the ramus. It's easy to palpate and is often easy to see. The duct runs anteromedially, so that's forwards and towards the midline, to small papilla that lies the floor of the mouth, just behind the central incisor. Remember, we have 2 of these, despite only 1 having been drawn on this image. The sublingual gland lies between the side of the tongue and the deep or the inner surface of the mandibular body. You can't see or feel this gland normally. Instead of a single duct, it has many, maybe 15 to 20 little ductiles. Both of these glands receive their secretomotor supply from the facial nerve, which is cranial nerve 7. The branches of cranial nerve 7 providing this function are completely different from those we have already met that supply the muscles of facial expression. The facial nerve leaves the brain and starts travelling through the temporal bone on its way out of the skull. While still inside the temporal bone, it gives off a branch that travels through the middle ear cavity. This branch is called the chorda tympani. The chorda tympani carries the preganglionic secretomotor fibres of the facial nerve out of the skull and onto an area lying medial to the ramus of the mandible. This is called the infratemporal fossa, which we'll come back to during anxiety and pain management. The chorda tympani then joins the lingual nerve, a branch of the mandibular nerve. The preganglionic fibres hitch a lift in the lingual nerve to reach the submandibular region, which is found just next to the submandibular gland. The preganglionic fibres then synapse with the postganglionic fibres inside the submandibular ganglion. The postganglionic fibres then leave the submandibular ganglion and travel to the submandibular and the sublingual glands, which are close by. Sympathetic innervation is also maintained in a simple manner to those found for the parotid gland, where we have the superior cervical ganglion passing postganglionic fibres into the blood vessels supplying the submandibular and the sublingual glands. These act as vasoconstrictors and reduce the secretion of saliva. Let's have a look at the learning objectives that we have covered today. So we can now list the locations of the minor salivary glands. We can describe the locations of the anatomical relations of the major salivary glands. We can describe the routes of the ducts of the major salivary glands and identify where these ducts open into the mouth. We can also give an account of the secretomotor nerve supply to the salivary glands.